Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn sessions for November. Firstly, I would like to begin with acknowledging the traditional custodians of our country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and the community. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and extend that respect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Today we have a super interesting conversation and topic from Amanda. I'll let her introduce her own piece, but I'm very excited to hear about it today. The Lunch and Learn topics are going to most likely continue into next year. So if you do have any other suggestions, please let us know. Also, the way that we'll be running the question and answer session today is via the chat. So if you do have any questions that pop up during Amanda's presentation, please pop them in the chat. And I'll run the question and answer session towards the end. And if you do, and if you could also please make sure you remain on mute and that your video is turned off throughout the presentation. And we'll take it from there. So Amanda, do you want to kick off? And thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. So my name's Amanda Mace. I am the general manager of a digital accessibility firm, WebKey IT, based in Perth, WA. And I'm just going to share my screen so that we have a few slides because I'm not entirely sure anyone really wants to be staring at my face the whole time. So, all right, let me minimize. There we go. All right, so today I'm talking to you about a white paper that was actually released back in May by WebKey IT, authored by the director of my company, Dr. Vivian Conway, and myself. The white paper was released on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, talking about the expectations of users, the perceptions organizations have of themselves, and then the reality. Is there a gap between how organizations think they're doing accessibility versus how they're actually doing accessibility from a user point of view? So last year, we distributed some user surveys as well as organizational surveys, basically in a bid to gather and get some evidence for the attitudes and approaches that we were seeing as accessibility consultants when we were working with various organizations and businesses. We wanted to know, did organizations think that they were doing digital accessibility well? So were their apps, their websites, their digital documents accessible? And did the users agree? Did they find that they were usable and accessible? We also knew that there was a lack of data up until this report. There was a lack of data around having at the same time individual responses and organizational responses so that a comparison could be made. Aside from all of this, we wanted to gauge where organizations were with accessibility, what were some of their hurdles and their needs, and what were the biggest issues that users were facing still today. So we got all of that. In fact, we got much more than that, but today I'm going to focus on that perception of organizations versus the reality, really, of the user experience. So we'll get into the responses that we had. The next slides are actually going to show the responses of the organizations on how accessible they believe they are and how well they think they're doing. Well, I'm a positive person, so we're going to start with really positive news. And in fact, it's quite great news, is that more than 90% of organizations answered and responded that they believe that digital accessibility is important. There is a small caveat to this, though. The surveys would have been distributed. They were obviously distributed originally out of WebKey IT, and they had a great global response. But it was probably shared by accessibility-minded people who are likely already fighting the good fight for accessibility within their organization, which means digital accessibility was already on the radar. 71% of the respondents had undertaken some sort of evaluation for accessibility, but almost half of those, almost half of those had their website tested for accessibility as an internal evaluation rather than hiring external experts. Now, this is a bit like checking your homework. Well, my children love that idea, by the way. It's probably not ideal. So we all very much would rather use carrot other than stick. So look at the positive side of digital accessibility. The truth is, it's probably worth mentioning that this has gotten companies in trouble before. The most recent example being GNC in the United States. And so for those of you who don't know, and probably you don't, is that GNC, which is the big health and nutritional company in America, got in trouble basically because the judge deemed them, and I quote, to not be experts with the appropriate knowledge about accessibility to even read automated testing results, let alone state that their website was accessible. So having an expert is actually an important thing. And in-house testing, while an important part of the process, probably isn't the only thing that should be done. So if you're interested in that particular lawsuit, it's Gomez versus GNC, and you can get more info about the judgment there. Now, despite the fact that we typically design with a mobile-first approach, one of the more surprising stats that came out of these surveys was that nearly half of the respondents are not testing for mobile accessibility at all. And I found that a little bit surprising, but even more so quite disappointing, because we know that most people are actually accessing their digital products from their mobile phone. When we did ask people to sort of break down what kind of testing they had done, it was a pleasant surprise to see that the majority actually were testing both for technical compliance and with users who have disabilities and seniors. It's not a large majority, but it is a sign that we're shifting more to a user-centric approach, which I'm sure as an accessibility person, I have UXers to thank for that, so thank you. We also asked if after initial testing, if remediation and then retesting was done. And most had, but this is obviously not as many as we'd like. We'd like to see everyone fixing the things that they have found in an audit or an evaluation, but most had. So at least we're trending in the right direction. If you think back just a few slides, I actually said that 71% had said that their websites had been tested for accessibility. However, only 9.5% carry any level of certification. And this is interesting on sort of two fronts. One is that's a very low number of certification. And secondly, in the question about the importance of compliance, 50% of the respondents actually said that it was necessary, and 33% believed it was a good investment, and then all the remaining said it was useful. So that question of the importance of certification certainly isn't, people see that importance, but they're not carrying through that into results of actually getting certified. The majority, in fact, you'll see here that it was 57% felt that their website was accessible, and 45% of those felt that they met either the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.0 or 2.1. Hold on, I did just say that only 9.5 had certification. So while basically, without even official certification or a compliance letter, organizations believe that they are meeting the standard, even if they can't prove it. So this is probably a good time to stop and just remind people that WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is an Australian standard. It's also an international standard under ISO. It's not exactly a BuzzFeed quiz. And in fact, even more interestingly is the perceived compliance around this. So compliance that's not backed up by certification or an audit came out with these numbers. 21% believe that they met WCAG 2.0, version 2.0 to level AA. That is the standard that we, as a bare minimum, are meant to be meeting here in Australia to avoid litigation. And 24% believe that they were meeting the newest recommendation from the W3C, WCAG 2.1 to level AA, which is interesting. There was an even more interesting response. 2% believed that they were meeting WCAG 2.1 to level AAA, which is interesting. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. The low percentage here does bring up some interesting questions about the attitude towards WCAG compliance, not just the actual, but in fact the perceived as well. There were some really positive results around incorporating digital accessibility into sort of standard operating procedures within an organization, and only a small amount said that it wasn't defined or not a consideration at all. There was a sub question to this around whether organizations are using things like digital accessibility maturity models. And the truth is only 14% actually said they were. So we're finding there isn't much uptake with that. Another important part of this research was to see what organizations felt their biggest accessibility need was. The answers were pretty varied. However, the leading needs were about needing more accessibility training, and this is even though 67% said that they had ongoing training for staff already in accessibility. Resources, unsurprisingly, resources to test and fix issues, and internal support rounded that out. Needing more information on the requirements actually scored fairly low, and there seems to be a lack of priority given to the actual standards and what needs to be done in order to meet them, which I think is reflected actually in those compliance numbers, both perceived and actual, that we looked at earlier. So it would seem from the responses of the organizations that they understand that digital accessibility is important, and most of the respondents actually felt that their website was accessible. But now I'd like to switch a little bit to the individual responses and talk a bit about what the user experience is like. So the survey was open to any individual, whether they had a disability or not, and we had a global response. In fact, both surveys were sent through numerous channels internationally, and about 40% of the responses came actually from Australia for the individual responses. With such great data from all over the globe, what was really interesting is that over 80% believed that their current accessibility laws in their country weren't sufficient. And I think that's worth noting. And that went for the majority of Australian responses too. We did ask people if they identified as having an impairment or a disability, and in the individual responses, 55% said that they had a disability. 8% of those did not associate with any disability support group. And this is an important note because I have heard it said that people with a disability have help and training to know how to make things easier via their settings and their operating systems. And aside from that being a fairly bold and big assumption, here we have evidence that not everyone is tapping into that resource, and that even then we're assuming that these organizations and support groups all have the information they need in order to help. So I thought those were interesting stats and worth sharing. As a part of understanding the broader scale of barriers, we also asked what other issues aside from disability affected people interacting with digital material. So some said they had age-related issues, and an example of that would be like my lovely mother-in-law, who's fairly tech savvy, but as she's gotten older, she's gotten a bit of a shake to her hand. And because of that, she actually finds using a trackpad or a mouse quite difficult. So even though she's tech savvy and she has the computer skills, using digital material is affected for her just because of her age. Financial limitations top that list, which is unsurprising. The disability pay gap is a real thing, as we know. The Equality and Human Rights Commission research report by Simonetta Longi backs this up, where it found that approximately 14% difference in the disability pay gap. There were also responses around access to technical support and advice, and lack of computer skills as well. The biggest issues that users are still facing, even in 2020, respondents here were able to take as many issues as they felt were applicable to them. And the main issues included poor design. I think that we can all relate to being frustrated when we encounter a really poorly designed website. CAPTCHA and other robotic detection methods. I think it's probably fair to say that this goes for everyone. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like the, you know, unreadable sequence of numbers and letters. And reCAPTCHA is almost worse, you know, where you have to click on, you know, all the images that have part of the sign in it. I still don't know if the corner of the street sign counts, or the pole, like do you have to click the pole? All of those things, they can be poor user experience all around, let alone accessibility. Poorly designed forms rated really highly, difficulty finding relevant information, and structure like headings and things like that also rated really highly. I actually think it's pretty clear, not just from the survey results, but these accessibility issues here seem to be, at least to me, quite usability issues for all of us. So it's something to take on board. We did have a response that said 66% of people had left a website because of its inaccessibility. Now, that's a pretty big number, and it includes respondents who didn't identify as having an impairment. So it's fair to say that if you owned a company or a business or an organization, that you would probably take note of that kind of number. As an accessibility professional, I often find myself making a business case for accessibility. Everyone wants to know what the return on investment is. And personally, I think this is it in black and white, or purple and red in my chart colors, because why not? This is it. This is the accessibility case. 66% of people are leaving websites because they're not accessible. We did ask about complaints. Who's complaining? Nearly 60% had complained at some point about a lack of accessibility on a digital product. Of those, 42% never returned to see if the issue was resolved. It seems likely to me anyways that they probably, unless it had to, didn't return at all to that website or that product. So you've probably lost that user for good. Obviously not very good business. Those who did go back to check, and maybe the most disappointing statistic to come out of the survey, was that only 12% found that the issue had been fixed. So that means that people are receiving complaints and they're not doing anything about it. And there are some cautionary tales, even here in Australia, around how badly that can go from a legal point of view and a PR point of view. When we asked users, does a website's design or accessibility affect your impression of the organization? 95% said yes. And that's a really powerful statement and a really good one. And I actually think that what it does is it shows that people it is important to them that we do digital accessibility well. So what do all of those numbers mean? Well, the perception right now is that organizations, they get it. They're actually saying, we get it and we're doing it well enough. And the expectation is that users are saying, look, if you get it, then you should be doing it well, full stop. The reality is that organizations, things aren't really as rosy as they seem to be, and users are frustrated about the lack of accessibility, and they believe that it reflects badly on an organization when it's not done well. So I think that we can do much better, and that we need to understand what are the first steps here to understanding the issues, work towards meeting the needs of all users, not just a small portion, but absolutely everyone, and take the opportunity really to unlock the web for people with disabilities. So look, guys, that's it for me. I'm happy to take questions, but I'd also like to encourage you to head to the link here, which is on the screen, webkeyit.com/white-paper, to see the white paper in its entirety. Thank you. I'm going to turn off my share screen now.
Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate the presentation, and I also appreciate you've been a long-term member of ARIA, so that's fantastic, and past accessibility judge for the Web Awards, so thank you very much. We don't have any questions yet, but I have a couple of comments from the presentation, which one of the things that was really highlighted to me was I've always known that accessibility is a big driving factor for people, but having that information to back up when we're talking to clients, about 34% of people, I messed up my notes now, sorry, especially around the impression of accessibility, with 95% of people saying yes, that really affects their impression of an organisation. That on its own is a huge factor for us. I was wondering if you have any key findings around e-commerce and accessibility from that research, or is it just more general?
Not from that particular research, but we did have research that was Australian based the year before, actually. In 2019, it was released by the Centre for Inclusive Design that said basically people with disabilities have a disposable income that's not, the potential is not being reached, of about $40 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, so that research, in fact, I'm happy to share that research around. It's really interesting. It does include the retail sector, education, and some other sectors. Really interesting findings. And that was around inclusive design, which does obviously take into account.
Cool. We have some questions coming in, which is fantastic. Thanks, guys. The first question is from Mark. Do you have any examples of litigation in Australia due to poor accessibility?
Absolutely. So we are much less litigious than America, and let's all be thankful for that. The approach here is much more mediation. However, the big two examples are the Sydney Olympics. In fact, it was the first time the Disability Discrimination Act had been used for a civil lawsuit in this particular case. And the most recent example is actually about 5 years ago, where Coles was sued. Coles used to be the cautionary tale. I like to say that that they've moved on from that, and now they're a tale of redemption. So when Coles was sued, they were sued by a blind lady who wasn't able to access their website and check out for her groceries. They actually went to mediation. So the approach here is that you go to the, you complain to the website owner, then you go to the Human Rights Commission. They investigate that this is actually an issue, and you just, it's not that you don't know how to use your assistive technology or your computer. Then mediation starts, and throughout it, obviously, for whatever reason, unbeknownst to us, Coles did not make the fixes, and they ended up in court. They settled out of court for an undisclosed amount of money, promised never to be so naughty again. But what it did do was it put a fire under Coles, who have just last year won an Australian Access Award for that same website, which had previously been broken. So there's a real redemption story in that. They have an accessibility team. They have a panel of accessibility experts they go to when they need audits. And it's just really, it's a great story now, but it did go through some hardships at first.
But that is a good story. Ellie teaches web design at university. She wants to know, what do you find many new graduates aren't aware of when it comes to accessibility?
Oh, all of it. I think the importance of accessibility is quite low on the list at unis, unfortunately. Sometimes WCAG gets touched on, but not often. I think even just the importance of validating code and using best practice, those sort of things are lost. I think there's a lot of misconception about color and how color can be used or not used in order to meet the standard. Lots of work to do in the education space.
Ali says, thank you very much. Richard has a question about, what are the most common issues that Australian websites experience in regards to accessibility?
Look, for every accessibility expert, you'll probably get a different answer for this, to be honest, because we all, once you kind of draw yourself to a certain thing initially. I think the most important is that I don't think we take enough consideration when we talk about colors. I also think that really movement is so, we talk about blinking and, oh, no one has blinking anymore. And thank goodness, by the way, thank you for not, we're moving on from that. And no one has blinking, and that's great. But we have lots of movement all of the time on websites with no way to pause or stop it. And this affects more than just people who are potentially epileptic, but someone with ADHD can't concentrate on the content if there's movement they can't stop. Or someone with dyslexia will have trouble, more so than they already are, reading content if there's movement in the corner that they can't stop. Those little bits and pieces that We think make for a really great website can actually be really distracting. And it means that people aren't able to access that content and process it as well as they could have.
Yeah, movement and accessibility is something that I've only unfortunately became more aware of. There was a great presentation. Unfortunately, I can't remember the lady that did. Yeah, and moving forward. So, yeah, education on those kind of things are critical for us. So, yeah.
Understanding basic inclusive design principles will help lots of people. So Microsoft has an inclusive design toolkit, which is completely free, that they produced a few years ago. And I really recommend people having a look at it. Basically what it says, it's got a great slogan, solve for one, extend to many. So if you haven't heard this, look it up. Basically what it says is that if you find a solution for a person with one arm, you've also found a solution for the person with a broken arm or the parent holding a child. Right, so while not all of us have permanent disabilities, we have all at some point been temporarily or situationally disabled and had barriers in our way. So it's all about thinking it outside of the boxes. What does movement do, not just for someone with a disability, but just every day? Personally, too much movement for me and I tune out.
That's a perfect example. I'll have to look that up. We don't have any other further questions, but I would like to thank you very much for your efforts today, Amanda. It's greatly appreciated for sharing that today. And I'd like to thank everybody else for coming along today. This presentation will be shared across the entire membership. So if you do have any further questions, please refer back to the presentation, or I'm sure Amanda will be happy to answer any that she has.
Yeah, absolutely. At the very last slide there had my email, so please get in touch if you have any questions.
Excellent. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much.